1. Introduction to market structure. 23. 2. What you will learn. What is the meaning of market structure? What are the 4 principal types of market structure? 3 types of market structure. In order to develop models and make predictions about how producers will behave, we have developed 4 principal models of market structure. Perfect competition. Monopoly. Oligopoly. Monopolistic competition. Types of market structure, visually.
Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well today. Well, let's take a look at market structures, this introduction and overview video that's going to help you understand what we do in theory of the firm with the model that you learn at the beginning called production, costs, revenues, and profits. Okay, here we go. All right, the market structures. These are the case studies, right? These are the case studies to which you are going to apply the cost, revenue, and profit model that you learned in the first chapter. All right, so what are they? Well, they're perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. Okay, these 4 market structures are what exists in the marketplace that we are going to apply the production, costs, revenues, and profit model that all firms do. That model is a model that goes on in theory inside firms when they're trying to decide what the perfect price is for each particular good that they make. Then, these market structures are structures that exist on the outside of the firm that they might participate in. So think about costs, revenues, and profits, sometimes called production, costs, revenues, and profit, as a model that you're going to apply to these things, okay? So here's another way of thinking about it. Every firm's going to figure out what their cost, revenue, and profit are, but the way they behave is going to be dictated by the structure in which they have to behave. So if they're in a perfect competition market, they're going to behave a certain way. If they're a monopoly, they're going to behave a certain way. If they're monopolistic competition, they're going to behave a certain way. Oligopoly, they're going to behave a certain way. And those behaviors are going to be different, just like you behave different at school than you do at home, than you do with your grandparents, than you do with your friends. Okay? You're still you. You still make the same decisions, right? But the way that you behave in the marketplace or in the structures, or the way that you behave is dictated by the structures around you. All right. So have that in your mind, right? And here's the other thing, and this is the thing that's super important, I think, for econ students to realize, is that economics is human behavior. And you know for sure that if you are a monopoly, you are the only game in town, you are going to charge as high a price as possible. And still, hopefully, people will be able to afford it, right? So you can maximize your profits. If you're an oligopoly, you're going to have a few competitors, right? But you're still going to try to charge as high as you can based on what they do in order to maximize your profits. And in perfect competition, which, by the way, I'm going to talk about in a second, which is the opposite of monopoly, this is where there's like no barriers of entry and there's incredible amounts of competition. You're going to behave a different way. Right? And you know that. You know that if you're just going to start your own little business and you have this knowledge, because this is human behavior. Economics is human behavior turned into philosophy. And the philosophy is what turns into how we behave in certain market structures, because frankly, you know, it's just human behavior put on flat diagrams. All right, so let's take a look at the market structures, the first 2, perfect competition and monopoly. All right, perfect competition. It is obviously one of the 4 market structures with the following characteristics. Number 1, a large number of small firms. In perfect competition, the firms have no control over price. All firms sell a homogeneous product. There are no barriers of entry, and there's perfect information and perfect resource mobility. Examples of this: agricultural and commodity markets, and the foreign exchange market. Okay, first thing, the idea of perfect competition, guess what? It's super theoretical. I think the best way of explaining how this works is if you have ever traveled and exchanged money from one currency to the other, because that is a market, And the foreign exchange market, guess where they get the exchange rate? From the outside. They get it from the Forex market, from the foreign exchange markets where there's massive amounts of currencies traded every day. That's where the price comes from. The firms that operate in the market structure perfect competition have no control over price. They're what is called price takers. If you're a price taker and you try to change the price, you ain't going to stay in business very long. Just think about yourself at an airport or like, I don't know, in some tourist area traveling, and you want to change whatever currency you have in your pocket to another currency, and you roll up and there's 4 kiosks, right? And 3 of them have the same price because they use the Forex market price from the currency markets, and one is trying to, charge you too much. Are you going to go there? No, you're not going to go there. So if you're in the foreign exchange market, right, if you have a kiosk, what are you going to do to attract visitors? Well, you're going to have a nice store. Maybe you have, the way that it looks outside. You have your people in uniforms. You make yourself look professional, right? Because you ain't changing the price. All right. So that's perfect competition. The other thing that's super important is this: realize that there are no barriers to entry. And this barrier of entries thing is really important, and they're different in the different market structures. And I want you to think about it this way. If you think about a high school soccer game, at most high schools, think of it in like a metaphorical sense. Most high school soccer games, you can just kind of roll up and watch the game. There's basically no barriers to entry. You don't need any money. Maybe you got to, get past the front gate. But after that, you can just kind of get there. Or if there is, a charge to get into the game, it's pretty nominal, right? Okay. As opposed to going to, a National Basketball Association game or like a professional soccer game, in London. Like, there's a lot of barriers to entry. First of all, the tickets are expensive. Third of all, there's a lot of security. And fourth of all, you got to go to the one stadium, and you can't just see the game. You have to actually go inside the stadium, right? So in a metaphorical sense, barriers to entry means that it's very difficult to get in. It's much more difficult to get into the Arsenal game than it is to get into your high school soccer game, okay? So metaphorically speaking, think about that's what barriers of entry mean. In perfect competition, there's very, very low barriers of entry. All right, cool. We got that one done. Now, monopoly. Monopoly is one of the 4 market structures with the following characteristics, and you need all of these. A single dominant large firm, significant control over price, producers sell a unique product with no close substitutes, high barriers to entry in the industry. And the examples of these are telephone, water, and electric companies in areas where they operate as a single supplier. When I was a kid, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and there was one energy company, and everybody bought their power, their electricity from this one energy company. Now, they were a monopoly. They could have charged whatever they wanted, and in order to control them, the government regulated what the prices were, but they had complete power over the market, right? Another example also from the 80s and 90s was Microsoft, and obviously Microsoft is still around, but Microsoft created the dominant operating system in the world still today, which is the DOS system originally that Bill Gates, came up with along with his friends, and it turned into the Windows system. Great, so they're a monopoly in the operating systems, but then what they tried to do is use that market structure, right, to sell other products, and that's how Microsoft Word became what it was, and that's how PowerPoint became what it is. And also, they tried to use that power to integrate something called Internet Explorer, which was a web browser, right, when the internet was coming out in the mid-90s. And they tried to use one market power that they had of monopoly in the operating system, and they made their operating system, which controls that particular PC, only be able to use the web browser, which controls access to the web. And that monopolistic power got broken down by the United States Justice Department, and they thought of the abuse of power. So monopolies is a way in which firms operate. And of course, if you have your cost, revenue, profit, and you're the only show in town, well, then guess what? You can charge whatever price you want, in theory, so long as people can afford it. Okay? So that is monopoly. All right, let's take a look at the 3rd and 4th market structure. Monopolistic competition. Check it. Monopolistic competition, what is it? It's one of 4 market structures. This is the one that students have the most difficult kind of understanding. One of 4 market structures with the following characteristics: a large number of firms, substantial control over market price, product differentiation, no barriers to entry, or very low barriers of entry. The best example, I think, is actually not shoe companies, clothing companies, detergent, computer publishing. Okay, that comes from Jocelyn Blink, but I actually think the best example is of monopolistic competition would be like, let's say that you live in a small western town of the United States, maybe in like western Colorado or something, I don't know. I live in Santiago, Chile, so this is far from a place I've been lately. I used to live in Breckenridge, Colorado, but let's say that you decided to open up a sushi restaurant, yeah? And there's no other sushi restaurants in this small little town. And great, so what are you? You are, check it, a monopoly of what? Sushi. But that's not the only market that you compete in. The market that you compete in is the market for the going out to dinner market, right? The dining market. So while you have monopoly in your one thing, you're actually part of a market that's bigger than you. So as a result of that, you're going to have to compete in a very highly competitive market, which is restaurants, right? The restaurant industry. So you can't really charge whatever you want for your sushi rolls, because if you price your sushi rolls too expensive, too high, they're too expensive, then people aren't going to go to your restaurant. They're going to go have some Italian dinner. They're going to go to a burrito joint, or they're going to go get some good, I don't know, some other kind of food. I can't even think of it. They're going to go to a steakhouse and have a good steak. So even though you're monopoly in your product, in sushi, you're going to have to price your product with products that you're competing against heavily, which would be, like a plate of pasta at a nice Italian restaurant, or, a really good burrito at a Mexican restaurant, okay? So that is how a monopolistic competition market works. And I'd like the shoe companies here, and those of you who live in the United States, or those of you who follow basketball, or those of you who follow soccer, I can use, two examples. It's like, the shoe market is it's like super highly competitive. So what do they try to get a monopoly on? They try to get a monopoly on really famous athletes. That's why Lionel Messi, that's why Adidas is paying him millions of dollars a year. LeBron James and Kyrie Irving in basketball, that's why they're getting paid millions of dollars a year, because quite frankly, it's pretty cool to have LeBrons. And if you have LeBrons, well, then that's a monopoly on any sort of shoe that has LeBron's name on it. And LeBron James is undoubtedly the best player in the world right now in basketball. So guess what? Nike kind of has a monopoly on basketball shoes that have LeBron's name on it, but they're competing in a broader market. So it's monopolistic competition. All right. The last one, oligopoly. Oligopoly is one of four market structures with the following characteristics. A small number of large firms in the industry. Firms have significant control over price. Firms are interdependent on each other. Products may be differentiated or homogeneous, and there are high barriers to entry. And I actually think the best example of this is the car industry, maybe not so much now, but maybe like 20 years ago. Before Hyundai was a global product coming out of South Korea, which is just astounding. What South Korea has done is astounding, absolutely astounding. Before Mahindra came out of India, and out of China comes the brand of Great Wall, which is part of a larger conglomerate of car makers. But before that, in the United States at least, you had Ford, Chrysler, GM. They are the only companies that made cars. Then later on, Honda came in. Toyota came in terms of like the regular, sort of mid-range car prices. Of course, there's BMW, and there's the higher end Mercedes-Benz, and of course, cars from Europe. But in terms of like in the United States, there are basically like five car companies, right? They're an oligopoly. Is it hard to get into that industry? Yeah, you gotta have millions and millions of dollars and a lot of expertise to start making cars. So those firms could have worked as an oligopoly, well, they do work as an oligopoly, but they could have actually colluded together to set the price of cars. And also, they're interdependent on one another. So if all of a sudden, which happened after the September 11th, 2001 events in New York City and in Washington, D.C., people in the United States stopped flying in planes, right? And also the price of gasoline went way up because the price of oil went way up. And guess what happened? The car industries really, really suffered. And they all suffered at once because they're interdependent on one another. Okay? So other examples of this would be like airlines, electrical appliance manufacturers, steel, aluminum, copper, cement industry. Cemex is a great example. Cemex is a huge company that practically owns the cement market in Mexico. It comes from Mexico and Central America. I lived in Nicaragua for 4 years, and like the only options you had were basically Cemex cement. Super interesting company, very powerful, but they work, of course, in competition with other large cement manufacturers. Okay, so there are the four market structures: perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, oligopoly. These are the market structures that you are going to look at for how the firms behave using the model that you used of production, costs, revenues, and profits. All right, my friends, I hope you found this video to be helpful, and I'll talk to you in a bit.
Perfect competition, key characteristics, part 1. 1. There are many buyers and sellers, each with a small market share. Market share, the fraction of the total industry output accounted for by that producer's output. This means both sellers and buyers are price takers, their actions have no effect on price. Each participant is a drop in the bucket. 6. Learn by doing, practice question 1. Which of the following markets is likely to be the most competitive? A. Cable television. B. Automobiles and trucks. C. Oil refining. D. Farm commodities. 7. Perfect competition, key characteristics part 2. 2. The product is standardized across sellers. Standardized product, aka commodity, consumers regard different sellers' products as equivalent. 1. 8. Perfect competition, key characteristics part 3. 3. Free entry and exit. New producers can easily enter into an industry and existing producers can easily leave that industry. 9. The meaning of monopoly. Monopolist, a firm that is the only producer of a good with no close substitutes. An industry controlled by a monopolist is known as a monopoly. Market power, the ability of a firm to raise prices. 10. Why do monopolies exist? How do they get away with this and protect their profit from new firms? Profits will not persist in the long run unless there is a barrier to entry. 11. Barriers to entry. Barriers to entry are essential for monopolies. They generate profit for the monopolist in the short run and long run. This can take the form of control of a scarce resource or inputs, increasing returns to scale, technological superiority, network externalities, government-made barriers, including patents and copyrights. 12. Barrier number 1, control of a scarce resource or input. If De Beers owned nearly all of the diamond mines in the world, it would have a monopoly in diamond production. 13. Barrier number 2, increasing returns to scale. A natural monopoly exists when increasing returns to scale, economies of scale, provide a large cost advantage to a single firm. Your local natural gas provider is a natural monopoly, and so are most utilities. 14. Barrier number 3, technological superiority. A firm that maintains a consistent technological advantage over potential competitors can establish itself as a monopolist. 15. Barrier number 4, network externality. Network externality, the value of a good or service to an individual increases as more individuals use the same good or service. 16. Learn by doing discussion question 1. Should Macmillan Publishing have let Amazon sell its ebooks at $9.99, a loss after paying for the copyright? 1. How are network externalities related to this issue? 2. Were publishers right to be fearful of Amazon's pricing policy even though it probably generated higher book sales? 3. Do you support Amazon's response, removal of all Macmillan books from the website? Policy was reversed after bad press. 17. Barrier number 5, government-created barrier. A patent gives an inventor a temporary monopoly in the use or sale of an invention. A copyright gives the creator of a literary or artistic work sole rights to profit from that work. 18. Defining oligopoly. An oligopoly is a market that is dominated by a small number of firms. In perfect competition, no one firm has a monopoly, but producers can affect market prices. Oligopolies are prevalent in the U.S. The most important source of oligopolies is the existence of increasing returns to scale. 19. Oligopoly and the potential for collusion. Sellers engage in collusion when they cooperate to raise their joint profits, rather than compete with one another. The potential for collusion arises in oligopolies because the small number of producers makes the profits or oligopolies interdependent. What one producer does significantly affects the profits earned by other producers in the industry. 20. Is it an oligopoly or not? The Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, HHI, is the square of each firm's market sales summed over the industry. It is a measure of how concentrated the industry is. 21. Defining monopolistic competition. Part 1. Monopolistic competition is the market structure in which there are many competing firms in an industry, each firm sells a differentiated product, and there is free entry into and exit from the industry in the long run. Monopolistic competition is particularly common in service industries like restaurants and gas stations, but also exists in some manufacturing industries. Each producer has some ability to set the price of their product. 22. Defining monopolistic competition. Part 2. Monopolistic competition involves three necessary conditions. 1. Large numbers. Each seller has many competitors. 23. Defining monopolistic competition. Part 3. 2. Differentiated products. Product differentiation can come from different styles or types, different locations, or different levels of quality. 24. Defining monopolistic competition. Part 4. 3. Free entry and exit in the long run. New producers, with their own distinct products, can enter the industry freely in the long run. Firms will exit the industry if they are not covering their costs in the long run. 1. Perfect competition. 24. 2. What you will learn. What is perfect competition and why do economists consider it an important benchmark? What factors make a firm or an industry perfectly competitive? How does a perfectly competitive industry determine the profit-maximizing output level? What determines if a firm is profitable or unprofitable? 3. Production and profits, 1/2. Each firm's total revenue is equal to price times quantity sold, or TR equals P times Q. And profit equals total revenue minus total cost, or profit equals TR minus TC. When market price equals $72, profit is highest at Q equals 50. Table 24, 1 profit for Noel's farm when market price is $72. But there is another way to think about it. 5. Marginal analysis and the profit maximizing output. 1 of 2. Recall the profit maximizing principle of marginal analysis. The optimal amount of an activity is the level at which marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Marginal revenue, change in total revenue generated by an additional unit of output. MR equals delta TR / delta Q. Since the firm is a price taker, MR equals the price, the firm can sell as much as it likes at the current market price. Its marginal revenue curve is a horizontal line at the market price. Since the firm is a price taker, the firm faces a horizontal, perfectly elastic demand curve that is equivalent to its marginal revenue curve. Optimal output rule. Profit is maximized by producing the quantity of output at which the marginal revenue of the last unit produced is equal to its marginal cost. 6. Marginal analysis and the profit maximizing output. 2 of 2. Why is profit maximized where MR equals MC? Each time the firm produces another unit, there are extra costs and extra revenues. If producing another unit adds more to revenue than it costs, profit will increase. If MR greater than MC, producing more will add to profit. If MR less than MC, producing less will add to profit. Since MR equals P for competitive firms, the profit maximizing rule is to choose the quantity of output where P equals MC. 7. Table 24, 2 short-run costs for Noel's farm. As long as increasing production by one more unit creates more MR than MC, it makes sense to do it. The price-taking firm's profit-maximizing quantity of output. 9. When is production profitable? Recall that we are using economic profit, the profit that includes the implicit cost, the foregone benefits of the firm's resources, and the explicit cost, cash outlays. If TR greater than TC, the firm is profitable. If TR equals TC, the firm breaks even. If TR less than TC, the firm incurs a loss. We can also express this idea in terms of average revenue and cost per unit of output. If the firm produces a quantity at which P greater than ATC, the firm is profitable. If the firm produces a quantity at which P equals ATC, the firm breaks even. If the firm produces a quantity at which P less than ATC, the firm incurs a loss. 10. Costs and production in the short run.
In our study of the different types of markets, we are now going to dive a little bit deeper and understand perfect competition. Now, this notion of something being perfectly competitive, you might have a general idea of what it means. You might feel like it's very competitive, that there's a lot of people there maybe competing for your business, or maybe there's a lot of buyers and there are a lot of sellers. And that is generally true, but we're trying to be economists here, so we want to be very precise with our language. So when economists talk about perfect competition, they're talking about this somewhat very abstract state where you have many buyers and sellers, many sellers and buyers. Now that doesn't seem too abstract so far. We can imagine a lot of markets that have many sellers and buyers. Now another thing that defines perfect competition from an economics point of view is that they're selling identical products or services. Products or services. Now, this one seems a little bit harder because even when you can imagine a fairly competitive market, does everyone sell exactly the same thing? Well, you can imagine certain markets, maybe the market for water, or maybe the market for some type of energy, or maybe the market for produce gets pretty close to identical products or services. So far, it doesn't seem like that abstract of a thing. Now, another aspect of perfect competition is that every agent, so that would be the buyers, the sellers, the producers, the consumers, they have perfect information. Perfect information. Now, what does perfect information mean? It means that every participant in the market, the buyers and the sellers, they all know exactly what is happening in the market. So what goods or services are selling for what price and who is selling to whom. So once again, this gets a little bit more abstract because to get truly perfect information, not everyone in a market will always know everything that's going on. So once again, this is a little bit of an abstract idea that economists have introduced to be a little bit more precise. And the last aspect we're going to talk about, and this is also something that is a bit idealized, that doesn't truly exist in the real world, things close to this exist in the real world, is that there's no barriers to entry or exit. Now, we already mentioned some markets, say the market for agriculture. That doesn't quite have no barriers to entry or exit. You would somehow have to get land, you would have to get seeds, you would have to get fertilizer, you would have to hire people to put the seeds in and to harvest the crops. And so almost any industry, any market you imagine will have some barriers. But this is an idealized notion that economists like to think about. And of course, in the real world, things might approach this or be closer to perfect competition than, say, other markets. But when you're in this situation, let's analyze what will be happening. So we can look at the market as a whole for whatever this product and service is. So let me draw price versus quantity here for the market as a whole. So this is price, and this is quantity, and this is the market right over here. And so we've seen this multiple times in our economics journey, that you have an upward sloping supply curve. And once again, this is for the entire market. Let me do this in a different color. So you have an upward sloping supply curve like that. And you would have a downward sloping demand curve like that. And we know what the equilibrium price and quantity would be for the market. So this right over here would be the equilibrium quantity for the market. And this right over here would be the equilibrium price for the market. Now, how would this affect the decisions for the firm in perfect competition? Well, let's draw a similar analysis, but now at the firm level. So on this axis, you could view this for the firm, and so this is going to be the firm right over here, one of the participants in the perfect competition, one of the producers, one of the sellers. So on this axis, you could view this as price. You could also view this as marginal revenue. And you could also view this as marginal cost, because we're going to plot different curves here. And then on the horizontal axis, we're going to have quantity again, but this is once again the quantity that the firm produces. Now, first of all, we could think about the marginal cost for the firm. And we've seen this multiple times, that the marginal cost for the firm, it might look something like this. It, over time, might trend upwards something like this, where at some point every incremental unit is costing more and more to produce. Maybe it's harder to get the resources, harder to get the labor, whatever you want to say. So that's the marginal cost curve, fairly typical for a firm. And then we could think about their average total cost. And so the average total cost curve might look something like this. Let's draw it something like this. So our average total cost, we've seen this multiple times. Now, what is going to be the marginal revenue for this firm that is operating in perfect competition? Well, when it's operating in perfect competition, it just has to be a price taker. So every unit it sells is just going to get the market price for that unit. So in perfect competition, the firm, every participant that is really identical in a lot of ways, they're just going to take that price. Think about it. They won't be able to charge any more for their product or service than the market price, because their product or service is identical to everyone else's, and everyone knows it because of perfect information, and they would have no motivation to charge less either. They're just passive. You could view it that way when it comes to price. So if we just take this market price across, just like that, this right over here, this price is going to define the marginal revenue curve for that firm. So let me make this a bold curve right over here. This is going to be the marginal revenue for the firm. For every unit it sells on the margin, that's how much more revenue it's going to get. Now, you could also view this as the demand curve for the firm's product. You could also view this as the average revenue for the firm's product. And let me make this clear. This is for the firm, demand for the firm, which is equal to the price that the firm actually gets. So the big takeaway here is, in perfect competition, which is this somewhat idealized state that doesn't quite exist in the real world, certain markets can approach it. The firms are passive price takers. They have no say on what the price is going to be, and so it would be rational for them to just produce where their marginal cost intersects with their marginal revenue, because anything more than that, then for every incremental unit, they're going to be spending more money than they get in terms of revenue. And this passivity goes a little bit against some of our everyday notions of fierce competition. When we think about fierce competition, we often think about many players trying to constantly undercut each other. And in future videos, we'll talk about scenarios where that might happen. And you might think about whether or not you would want certain markets to have perfect competition. Because no barriers to entry means that, frankly, anybody could get into that industry. So, for example, you might not want perfect competition when it comes to someone being, say, your doctor, because you want barriers to entry. You want some level of training. You want some level of experience before someone gets into that service.
25. To what you will learn. How do we use graphs to determine a perfectly competitive firm's production decision? What determines a perfect competitor's economic profit or loss? When should a perfectly competitive firm shut down in the short run?
In our study of the different types of markets, we are now going to dive a little bit deeper and understand perfect competition. Now, this notion of something being perfectly competitive, you might have a general idea of what it means. You might feel like it's very competitive, that there's a lot of people there maybe competing for your business, or maybe there's a lot of buyers and there are a lot of sellers. And that is generally true, but we're trying to be economists here, so we want to be very precise with our language. So when economists talk about perfect competition, they're talking about this somewhat very abstract state where you have many buyers and sellers, many sellers and buyers. Now, that doesn't seem too abstract so far. We can imagine a lot of markets that have many sellers and buyers. Now, another thing that defines perfect competition from an economics point of view is that they're selling identical products or services. Products or services. Now, this one seems a little bit harder because even when you can imagine a fairly competitive market, does everyone sell exactly the same thing? Well, you can imagine certain markets, maybe the market for water, or maybe the market for some type of energy, or maybe the market for produce gets pretty close to identical products or services. So far, it doesn't seem like that abstract of a thing. Now, another aspect of perfect competition is that every agent, so that would be the buyers, the sellers, the producers, the consumers, they have perfect information. Perfect information. Now, what does perfect information mean? It means that every participant in the market, the buyers and the sellers, they all know exactly what is happening in the market. So what goods or services are selling for what price, and who is selling to whom? So once again, this gets a little bit more abstract because to get truly perfect information, not everyone in a market will always know everything that's going on. So once again, this is a little bit of an abstract idea that economists have introduced to be a little bit more precise. And the last aspect we're going to talk about, and this is also something that is a bit idealized, that doesn't truly exist in the real world, things close to this exist in the real world, is that there's no barriers to entry or exit. Now, we already mentioned some markets, say the market for agriculture. That doesn't quite have no barriers to entry or exit. You would somehow have to get land, you would have to get seeds, you would have to get fertilizer, you would have to hire people to put the seeds in and to harvest the crops. And so almost any industry, any market you imagine will have some barriers. But this is an idealized notion that economists like to think about. And of course, in the real world, things might approach this or be closer to perfect competition than, say, other markets. But when you are in this situation, let's analyze what will be happening. So we can look at the market as a whole for whatever this product and service is. So let me draw price versus quantity here for the market as a whole. So this is price, and this is quantity, and this is the market right over here. And so we've seen this multiple times in our economics journey, that you have an upward sloping supply curve. And once again, this is for the entire market. Let me do this in a different color. So you have an upward sloping supply curve like that. And you would have a downward sloping demand curve like that. And we know what the equilibrium price and quantity would be for the market. So this right over here would be the equilibrium quantity for the market. And this right over here would be the equilibrium price for the market. Now, how would this affect the decisions for the firm in perfect competition? Well, let's draw a similar analysis, but now at the firm level. So on this axis, you could view this for the firm. And so this is going to be the firm right over here, one of the participants in the perfect competition, one of the producers, one of the sellers. So on this axis, you could view this as price. You could also view this as marginal revenue. And you could also view this as marginal cost, because we're going to plot different curves here. And then on the horizontal axis, we're going to have quantity again, but this is once again the quantity that the firm produces. Now, first of all, we could think about the marginal cost for the firm. And we've seen this multiple times, that the marginal cost for the firm, it might look something like this. It, over time, might trend upwards something like this, where at some point every incremental unit is costing more and more to produce. Maybe it's harder to get the resources, harder to get the labor, whatever you want to say. So that's the marginal cost curve, fairly typical for a firm. And then we could think about their average total cost. And so the average total cost curve might look something like this. Let's see, draw it something like this. So our average total cost, we've seen this multiple times. Now, what is going to be the marginal revenue for this firm that is operating in perfect competition? Well, when it's operating in perfect competition, it just has to be a price taker. So every unit it sells is just going to get the market price for that unit. So in perfect competition, the firm, every participant that is really identical in a lot of ways, they're just going to take that price. Think about it. They won't be able to charge any more for their product or service than the market price, because their product or service is identical to everyone else's, and everyone knows it because of perfect information, and they would have no motivation to charge less either. They're just passive. You could view it that way when it comes to price. So if we just take this market price across, just like that, this right over here, this price is going to define the marginal revenue curve for that firm. So let me make this a bold curve right over here. This is going to be the marginal revenue for the firm. For every unit it sells on the margin, that's how much more revenue it's going to get. Now, you could also view this as the demand curve for the firm's product. You could also view this as the average revenue for the firm's product. And let me make this clear. This is for the firm, demand for the firm, which is equal to the price that the firm actually gets. So the big takeaway here is, in perfect competition, which is this somewhat idealized state that doesn't quite exist in the real world, certain markets can approach it. The firms are passive price takers. They have no say on what the price is going to be, and so it would be rational for them to just produce where their marginal cost intersects with their marginal revenue, because anything more than that, then for every incremental unit, they're going to be spending more money than they get in terms of revenue. And this passivity goes a little bit against some of our everyday notions of fierce competition. When we think about fierce competition, we often think about many players trying to constantly undercut each other. And in future videos, we'll talk about scenarios where that might happen. And you might think about whether or not you would want certain markets to have perfect competition. Because no barriers to entry means that, frankly, anybody could get into that industry. So, for example, you might not want perfect competition when it comes to someone being, say, your doctor, because you want barriers to entry. You want some level of training. You want some level of experience before someone gets into that service. In this video, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the notion of perfectly competitive markets. And we're going to think about under what scenarios a firm would make an economic profit or an economic loss in them. Now, as a reminder, these perfectly competitive markets are something of a theoretical ideal. There's few markets in the real world that are truly perfectly competitive. Some might get close, but most markets are someplace in a spectrum between perfectly competitive and at the other extreme, say something like a monopoly. But here we're talking about perfect competition. And in perfect competition, the firm's products aren't differentiated. There's no barriers to entry or exit. And so in that situation, the market supply and demand curves are going to define the price in the market, which are also going to define the marginal revenue for these firms. They're all going to be price takers. They're going to be passive in terms of price. Whatever the market price is, that's the price that they are going to sell their products for. And their decision is really what quantity to produce and sell and whether to enter or exit the market. So let's look at that a little bit. So these are just your classic and supply and demand curves you might see for a market. The first few units in the market, there's a huge marginal benefit, so people are willing to pay a lot. But then each incremental unit, the marginal benefit's a little bit lower and lower and lower and lower, and that's why we have that downward sloping demand curve. And then on the supply curve, the first unit in the market might be fairly inexpensive to produce, but then the marginal cost gets higher and higher and higher. And where they meet, where the supply and demand meet, that tells us the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in the market. And we can show that with that line, and let's just say that equilibrium price is $10. And as I just mentioned, that's going to have to be the price that all of the firms, and these might not be all of the firms in the market, but all of the firms in the market, if we're talking about a perfectly competitive market, would just have to take that price. So given that, what quantity would firms A, B, and C produce, and which of these firms would be profitable or not? I encourage you to pause the video and think about those two questions. If you could just answer which of these firms would be profitable or not, and we're talking about economic profit in this context. All right, well, let's look at firm A first. Well, firm A, for any of them, it is not rational to produce a quantity where the marginal cost is higher than the marginal revenue that the firm's getting. And remember, this line right over here, which is the price line, that is price, which is equal to marginal revenue. And so for that extra unit, if you can't sell it for more than you're producing, then you wouldn't produce that extra unit. So it's rational for them to produce more and more and more. The marginal cost goes higher and higher until right at the point that marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to price, the market price, which they're just going to take. So it's rational for this firm to produce this quantity right over here. So I'll just go quantity, I'll say quantity for that firm. Now, is this firm going to be profitable or not? Well, at this quantity, what's its average total cost? Well, its average total cost is right over there. And so for every unit, it's going to make this difference between the price or the marginal revenue it's getting and its average total cost. And so one way to think about the profit of this firm is, and we're talking about economic profit, it's going to be the area of this rectangle right over here. So let's say if the average total cost at that quantity is, let's say that this is $8, then this height of the rectangle is 10 minus 8. The height right over here, let me do this in a different color. This height right over here is $2. And then the width is going to be the quantity of that firm. And so let's say the quantity of that firm, let's say it's 10,000 units a year. 10,000 units per year. And so the area right over here would be $2 times 10,000. It would be $20,000. $20,000 per time unit. If we're talking all of this is, say, per year. Now let's go to firm B. Using that same analysis, is firm B making an economic profit or is it not making an economic profit? Well, firm B is once again going to be a price taker. And so the price right over here, the equilibrium price in the market, is going to be equal to the price that that firm has to take, which is going to be its marginal revenue curve. And that's why it's a flat marginal revenue curve, because no matter what quantity they produce, they're going to get that same price. And it wouldn't be rational for them to produce a quantity where marginal cost is higher than marginal revenue. And so they would produce right over there. Now, what is their economic profit at this quantity? So this is quantity of the second firm, firm B. I'll write it like that. Maybe that is firm A. And maybe this is also, it looks about the same. I'll make them a little bit different. Let's say that's 9,500 units per time period. Well, here the average total cost at that quantity is equal to the marginal cost. So, which is equal to the marginal revenue. So at that quantity, whatever that $10 they're getting per unit, they're also spending on average $10 per unit. Another way to think about it, the area of that rectangle is going to be 0 because it has no height. So this situation right over here, the firm has zero economic, all right, $0 of economic profit. And then last but not least, let's think about firm C. Pause this video and think about what its economic profit would be. Well, like we've seen, it would be rational for it to produce the quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to the market price. So it would produce this quantity right over here. And let's say that that quantity is 9,000 units. And what's its average total cost then? So at 9,000 units, its average total cost, let's say that that is $12 right over there. So what's its economic profit? So for every unit it's selling, it's getting $10 and it's costing $12 on average to produce it. So it's taking an economic loss of $2 per unit. So $2 per unit, so this height right over here is $2, times the units times 9,000, you're going to have 2 times 9,000, you're going to have an $18,000, not economic profit, but economic loss. Now, one thing to think about is, why would any firm be in this situation? Well, it's important to think about things in the short run versus the long run. In the short run, we've talked about this analysis right over here, where a firm can decide what quantity it would produce that is rational. Its fixed costs are fixed in the short run. We've studied that in multiple videos. But in the long run, its fixed costs aren't fixed. And so the firm can decide to enter or exit the market. And so for firm C, while they've already put in those fixed costs, it is actually rational for them to do it because they're actually able to make the marginal revenue they get up to that quantity. It's at least they're able to more than cover their marginal costs, and then they're able to eat up, or I guess you could say take care of some of their fixed costs, but they're still not able to run an economic profit. So in the long run, it wouldn't be rational for this firm to stay in the market. They would likely exit the market.
3. Profitability and the market price, 1 of 3. The farm is profitable because P greater than minimum ATC, $56. For profitability and the market price, 2 of 3. The farm's per unit profit, $72 minus $57.60 equals $14.40. Total profit. 50 times $14.40 equals $720. Five. Calculating total costs and profit. Profit equals TR minus TC equals TR slash Q minus TC slash Q times Q, or profit equals P minus ATC times Q. The break-even price of a price-taking firm is the market price at which it earns zero profit. 7. Learn by doing practice question 1. If a firm is earning positive economic profit, it must be the case that A. Price is less than average cost. B. Price is equal to average cost. C. Price is equal to total cost. D. Price is greater than average cost. Correct answer. A. Profitability and the market price, 3 of 3. The farm's per unit loss, $58.67 minus $40 equals $18.67. Total loss, 30 times $18.67 equals $560. 9. The short-run production decision. Losses don't mean immediate shutdown. Fixed costs must be paid regardless of whether the firm produces in the short run. Since it cannot be changed, fixed cost is irrelevant to the decision about whether to shut down in the short run. Other costs, variable costs, do matter. When the market price is below minimum average variable cost, a firm should cease production immediately. The minimum average variable cost is equal to the shutdown price. When price is greater than minimum average variable cost, however, the firm should produce in the short run.
We've spent several videos already talking about graphs like you see here. This is the graph for a particular firm. Maybe it's making donuts, so it's in the donut industry. And we can see how the marginal cost relates to the average variable cost and average total cost. We go into some depth several videos ago, but we see that trend that marginal cost can trend down initially because as quantity increases, each incremental unit could benefit from things like specialization. And then the marginal cost, the cost of each incremental unit as a function of quantity, could go up because of things like coordination costs. And then we've also seen how that relates to average variable cost, that while marginal cost is below average variable cost, every incremental unit is going to bring down the average variable cost. But then when marginal cost crosses average variable cost, well, now every incremental unit is going to bring up the average variable cost. And the same thing happens once it crosses the average total cost. And of course, the difference for any given quantity between the average total cost and the average variable cost, that is the average fixed cost. Now, with that out of the way, we're going to think about how this firm would react under different market conditions. We're going to assume that it's in a very competitive, or we could say a perfectly competitive market, and so it is a price taker. And so let's first imagine what would be a positive scenario for this firm. Let's imagine the price up here. So let's call this P sub 1. And in a previous video, we already said it would be rational for a profit maximizing firm to produce at a quantity where the marginal cost and the marginal revenue is meet. And if we're talking about a competitive market, then this price right over here is not going to be a function of the firm's quantity, so that's why it's horizontal, and it would be the same thing as the marginal revenue. So in this situation, at P sub 1, the firm would produce Q sub 1, and this is a good situation for the firm because the price that it's getting is higher than its average total cost, and so there is going to be a nice amount of profit for this firm. The profit is going to be the price minus the average total cost at that quantity times the actual quantity. So because P1 is greater than the average total cost, we have a situation where the firm is profitable. Firm is profitable. It would want to stay in the market, but because you have a profitable firm in this market, and you're likely to have many profitable firms in that market, it will probably attract entrants. Attract entrants. Other people might say, hey, I want to make just as much money as this donut company right over here than this firm. And so you'll probably have more and more entrants into the market, which will probably reduce the prices. Now, they could reduce the prices until you get to a price that looks something like this. So I will call that P sub 2. Now, a profit maximizing firm in this world would keep producing until the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue, which in this case is the price. And so this would be, my lines aren't completely straight there, but you get the idea. So that's Q sub 2. Now in this situation, P sub 2 is equal to the average total cost. So the firm is break even. It's not running at a loss or a profit. So it is break even. And so here, the firm is neutral about whether in the long run it stays in the market or it exits the market, but you're no longer likely attracting entrants. So no longer attracting entrants. But it does make sense for the firm to keep operating at this situation, even in the long run, because it is at least break even. Now let's imagine another scenario. Let's imagine this price level. So for whatever reason, the market price gets to that. As we've talked about, a rational firm would be producing at Q sub 3. And at P sub 3 right over here, there's some interesting things. Because P sub 3 is less than your average total cost, your firm is running at a loss. It's running at a loss here. So firm, not profitable. Not profitable. Now you might say, well, what is this firm likely to do? Would it just shut down? Well, in the short run, it would not make sense for this firm to shut down because the price that it's getting is still higher than its average variable cost. In the short run, the fixed costs, they've already been spent. So you might as well get as much incremental profit on the margin as you can. And so as long as the price is higher than the average variable cost, well, outside of their fixed costs, they're still making some money to make up those fixed costs. So you have two things going on. So they would stay operating in the short run, stay operating in the short run. But what would this firm do in the long run? Well, in the long run, it makes no sense to have to be in a market where you can't make a profit. So in the long run, it will exit. So it will exit in the long run. And in general, the terminology when people are talking about, well, do you start or stop in the short run? They usually talk about, do you either shut down or operate in the short run? And then in the long run, where it's like, hey, are you going to sell your factories or somehow dismantle them, or are you going to build new factories? That's all about exiting or entering the industry. And of course, you have another even worse scenario for this firm, which might be down here, where you have price sub 4. Here, in theory, this is where we intersect the marginal cost curve, Q sub 4. Now here, it makes no sense for the company to operate at all. So because P sub 4 is less than the average total cost, you would want to exit in the long run, exit the market. But you wouldn't even wait for that long, wait to sell your factories. Because P sub 4 is less than your average variable cost, you would also just shut down in the short run. So big picture, from a firm's point of view, you obviously want to be at P1 where you make a profit, but you might attract entrants. At P sub 2, you as a firm in the long run are neutral versus exiting the market or entering the market or other people entering the market. You're at break even. At P sub 3, in the long run, you'd want to exit because you're not profitable if the prices stay at P sub 3. Your price is below your average total cost at the rational quantity to produce. So in the long run, you would exit. But because P sub 3 is greater than your average variable cost at the rational quantity, you would stay operating in the short run. And then the last scenario, of course, is P sub 4, where the price gets so low that it just doesn't make sense to even operate another moment.
10 Learn by doing practice question 2. If Gnomes R Us, a competitive firm, produces where the marginal cost curve intersects with the average total cost curve at its minimum point, the firm will earn A. Positive economic profits, B. Zero economic profits, C. A short-run loss, B. Zero economic profits. Correct answer. 12 Learn by doing practice question. Should a competitive firm keep producing even if it faces short-run losses and is producing at a point on its MC curve that is above the minimum ABC curve? A. Yes, it is earning normal profits. B. Yes, because it covers its variable costs and some fixed costs. Correct answer. C. No, it should never incur losses. 14. The short-run individual supply curve. A firm will produce at every price above minimum ATC, where price intersects the MC curve. But will stop producing in the short run if the market price falls below the shutdown price, so the MC curve above shutdown price is the firm's supply curve. Changing fixed cost. Buying or selling equipment allows a firm to change its fixed cost. A firm will choose the level of fixed cost that minimizes the average total cost for its desired output quantity, and that may mean closing down altogether. 16. Summing up. One long-run outcomes in perfect competition. 26.2. What you will learn. Why does it make sense for a firm to behave differently in the short run versus the long run? How does the short-run industry supply curve differ from the long-run industry supply curve? 3. The short-run industry supply curve. The industry supply curve shows the relationship between the price of a good and the total output of the industry as a whole. The short-run industry supply curve shows how the quantity supplied by an industry depends on the market price given a fixed number of producers. There is a short-run market equilibrium when the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, taking the number of producers as given. For the short-run market equilibrium. The short-run market equilibrium, the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, taking the number of producers as given. 5. The long-run market equilibrium.
Deeper into what happens in perfectly competitive markets in the long run. So what we have on the left-hand side, and we've seen this multiple times already, is our supply and our demand curves for our perfectly competitive market. And you can see the equilibrium price right over here, marked with this dotted line. And as we've talked about in multiple videos, the firms in that perfectly competitive market, the perfectly competitive firms, they just have to be price takers. So the market price is going to be their marginal revenue curve, and it's going to be this horizontal curve. And it would be rational for them to produce the quantity. So they're not going to set the price, but they can choose what quantity to produce. But it would be rational for them to keep producing while the marginal revenue is higher than the marginal cost, up to and including when the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. So for this firm at this current state of affairs, it would be rational for them to produce this quantity right over there. And as we've talked about in other videos, at that quantity, they're going to make an economic profit. And the way that we can see that is at this quantity, this is the average total cost. That is your marginal revenue. And so you are going to get this much per unit, and then you multiply. So the height is how much you get per unit, and then you multiply that times the number of units. So the area of this rectangle is that positive economic profit that this firm will have. Now that's in the short run. But now let's think about what will likely happen in the long run. If folks see other folks making a positive economic profit, remember, economic profit doesn't just account for regular costs, it also includes opportunity costs. So a lot of people say, hey, I would want to put my resources into this market so that I can make that positive economic profit as well. But what's going to happen as you have entrance into this market? Well, that's going to shift the supply curve to the right. At any given price, you're going to have more supply, is one way to think about it. So if that's supply curve, let's just call that 1. Now you're going to have more entrants. More entrants. And what's going to happen? Well, you might get to something like, you might get to a situation like this. Actually, let me see if I can draw it well. You might get to a situation like this, where you have more entrants, and you go to supply curve 2. Now what's going to be the quantity that firm A produces in that world? Remember, firm A is just one of many firms. Well, in this situation, we have a new equilibrium price. So if this was P sub 1, now we have this new equilibrium price, P sub 2, which is going to define a new marginal revenue curve for all of the players in this perfectly competitive market. And so the new marginal revenue curve is going to be right over there. Now, in this situation, what is the rational quantity for firm A to produce? Well, once again, as long as marginal revenue is higher than marginal cost, it makes sense for them to produce more and more and more up until the point that they are equal. So now firm A would want to produce less because the market price that it just has to take is less. But notice what happens as more and more entrants got into the market. The market price, which also defines this horizontal marginal revenue curve, went lower and lower to the point where firm A now in this situation is making no economic profit. At this point, not only is marginal revenue intersecting marginal cost, but that's exactly at the point at which marginal cost is equaling average total cost. So one way to think about it is, in a perfectly competitive firm, they are productively efficient. They are producing the quantity that minimizes their average total cost. We've already talked about that point where marginal cost and average total cost intersect. That's going to be the minimum point for average total cost. And why is that? Well, while marginal cost is below average total cost is going to get lower and lower and lower. And then once marginal cost gets higher than average total cost, well, then the average total cost curve will start curving up. So we just saw a situation that even where we see economic profit in the short run, in the long run, entrants are going to go into that market and it's going to reduce the economic profit down to zero. And at that point, the firm that has that zero economic profit, they are productively efficient. They are producing at the minimum point of their average total cost curve. And we've already talked before that this equilibrium point right over here in our market, because our demand and supply curves, the intersection point is defines the price, our equilibrium price and quantities. We are also allocatively efficient. We've talked about things like deadweight loss in the past. That is not happening right over here. Our marginal benefit is equal to our marginal cost right at that equilibrium price and quantity. Now, some of you might be saying, well, what about the other situation? What about if for some reason we were in let's call it a supply curve 3. Let's see, people overshot. Too many people joined into this market. So let's say we went to supply curve 3. Well, what's going to happen? And let me label this. This is right over here. This is marginal revenue curve 1, which is equal to price 1. This is marginal revenue curve 2, which is equal to price 2. And then this would define, so this right over here would be price 3, which would define marginal revenue curve 3. So marginal revenue curve 3, which is equal to price 3. Well, if too many entrants joined into that market, now firm A has a more difficult scenario. They would produce at this quantity, we've talked about many times already, but at that quantity, each unit, their average total cost is higher than that revenue they're getting. So they're going to be running at an economic loss in the short run. But what would happen in the long run? Well, firm A in the long run would probably exit the market, and other firms who are running an economic loss would exit the market. And so that would shift the supply curve back to the left. And so we would eventually get, once again, to that reality where firms have no economic profit. And we have a market that is allocatively efficient, no deadweight loss, and firms are producing at the minimum point of their average total cost curve, which is known as productive efficiency or productively efficient.
New firms enter as long as there is economic profit, peak greater than min ATC. A market is in long-run equilibrium when the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, given that sufficient time has elapsed for entry into and exit from the industry to occur. 6. The effect of an increase in demand in the short run and the long run. The LRS shows how the quantity supplied responds to the price, once producers have had time to enter or exit the industry. 7. Comparing the short-run and long-run industry supply curves. The long-run supply curve is flatter than the short-run supply curve. A higher price attracts new entrants in the long run, raising industry output and lowering price. A fall in price induces existing producers to exit in the long run, reducing industry output and raising price. 8. The long-run industry supply curve, 1/2. The long-run supply curve is perfectly elastic if costs are constant across the industry, if each firm, be it an incumbent or a new entrant, faces the same cost structure. Example, agriculture, in which there is a perfectly elastic supply of inputs. The long-run industry supply curve slopes upward when producers use an input that is in limited supply. As the industry expands, the price of that input goes up, and later entrants have a higher cost structure than early entrants. Example, beachfront resort hotels, which compete for a limited quantity of prime property. Such industries are said to have increasing costs. 9. The long-run industry supply curve. Industry supply curve slopes downward when an industry faces increasing returns to scale, in which average costs fall as output rises. Whether the long-run industry supply curve is horizontal or upward sloping or even downward sloping, the long-run price elasticity of supply is higher than the short-run price elasticity whenever there is free entry and exit.
All right, now let's dig a little bit more into analyzing perfectly competitive markets. And in particular, we're going to focus on the long run. And remember, the long run is the time span where firms can enter and exit the market. Or another way to think about it is, in the long run, fixed costs actually become variable. You can shutter factories or you can build factories in the long run. Now, in previous videos, we talked about that in the long run, in a perfectly competitive market, the firms that operate in that perfectly competitive market are going to be operating at zero economic profit. And you see that example right over here. As we've talked about in many, many videos, in a perfectly competitive market, the firms are price takers. That price is set by that equilibrium point between the supply and demand curves, and the firms just take that. And so their marginal revenue curve would just be a horizontal line that you see right over there. And zero economic profit happens when you produce a quantity where your average total cost is the same as your marginal revenue. For each unit, the amount that you get, which is that marginal unit, that's also how much it costs you to produce it. Now remember, when we're talking about economic profit, that includes your opportunity cost. So that doesn't mean that these firms are operating at zero accounting profit. They could still be making money, but if you were to factor in their opportunity costs, that's when you get things to zero. Now, what I want to think about, what happens in the short and long run if something, say, happens to market demand. Let's say that this is the market for apples, the fruit apples. So this is the market for apples we're talking about. This is the market as a whole. This is a firm that produces apples. It could be a farm of some kind. And let's say that a new study comes out that apples actually are super good for your health and they can be used as a performance enhancer for sports and all sorts of positive results. Well, what is likely to happen in the short run? And this is a little bit of review in terms of our supply and demand curves, and also what would happen to firm A's economic profits. Pause this video and think about that. Well, in the short run, your demand curve would shift to the right. And so, because at a given price, people are willing to demand more apples because it has all these new and exciting benefits. And so the demand curve might shift someplace like that. So that is D prime. And if the demand curve shifts like that, now we have a new equilibrium price in the market. Our new equilibrium price in the market is right over here. We also have a new equilibrium quantity. So our quantity has shifted from there to now there. So new equilibrium quantity. And we have a new equilibrium price. Let's just call this P prime. And at that new equilibrium price, well, now we have a higher marginal revenue curve for firm A. And now firm A, it would be rational for them to produce. Remember, it's rational for them to produce up until the marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Because each of those incremental units up to that point, they're going to be making money on those incremental units. And so now it's rational for them to produce at this quantity. Let me call that Q prime. And at this level, now all of a sudden firm A is making economic profit, because at this quantity, that's revenue per unit. This is average total cost per unit. So they're making this height per unit, and then you multiply it times your total number of units, which is the base of this rectangle. And so this area would represent this positive economic profit. Now you might be saying, wait, hold on a second. I thought you said in the long run, firms don't make economic profit in a perfectly competitive market. And that is true, at least based on the models that we are constructing. Because what happens when you have this positive economic profit? Well, other firms will enter this market. Remember, we're talking about a perfectly competitive market. There are no barriers to entry, and everyone is fairly non-differentiated, and they have similar cost structures. And so what you could imagine is, in the long run, folks will enter the market, and then the supply curve will also shift to the right. And assuming that that doesn't change the cost structure for the individual firms, and actually let me show someone entering into this market. So now firm B is entering this market, and when firm B enters the market, it has the same cost structure as firm A, and it didn't shift either of their cost structures. So this is known as a constant cost perfectly competitive market, where the entering or the exiting of firms does not affect the cost structures of the firms that are entering or that are in the market. And so in this situation, these graphs look the same, but now we have more firms entering the market. The supply curve will shift to the right, and it's going to keep shifting to the right until these firms that all have identical cost structures are no longer making economic profit again. It wouldn't shift further to the right because no one's going to enter if they're making economic loss. It'll keep shifting until no one is making that economic profit. And so you see what happened in this constant cost, perfectly competitive market, that now we are back to this equilibrium point where we are at a higher quantity because people like all the benefits of these apples, but we're at the price we were before, which is the same marginal revenue curve that we were before for the various players in this market. And so when you see something like this in a constant cost, perfectly competitive market, you can actually create a long-run supply curve. You could view this S and S prime as a short-run supply curve. The long-run supply curve, on the other hand, for a perfectly competitive market in which the cost structure of the participating firms do not depend on the number of firms that are in or out of the market, then your long-run supply curve in what we could call a constant cost, perfectly competitive market is going to be a horizontal line like this. So I will leave you there. In other videos, we'll think about, well, what happens if the cost structure changes for these firms depending on how many firms are in or out of the market? And that'll be based on how do the cost of the inputs into their production change as you have people entering or exiting that market. What we have here, we can view as a long-run equilibrium or long-run steady state for a perfectly competitive market. Let's say this is the market for apples, and it was this idealized, perfectly competitive situation where we have many firms producing, they're non-differentiated, they have the same cost structure, there's no barriers to entry or exit. And on the left, you can see that this equilibrium price, which is set by the intersection of the supply and demand curves, that's just going to be the price that the firms have to take. And we've talked about that at length in other videos. That's going to define that the firm's marginal revenue, not just this firm, but all of the participants in the market. In other videos, we've talked about the fact that the rational quantity for this firm to produce would be where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost. And it's also going to be the point where you have zero economic profit, where at that quantity, let's say the quantity for the firm, your average total cost is equal to your marginal revenue. If marginal revenue were higher than average total cost at this quantity, well, then you would have other entrants into the market because you're having positive economic profit. If marginal revenue is below average total cost at that quantity, well, then firms are running economic losses and you will have people exiting the industry. And either of those situations would get us back to an equilibrium state that looks something like this. But now let's imagine a shock to the market somehow. Let's say a new research study comes out that says that the apples that this market produces, that it's incredibly good for you, it'll make you live longer, it'll make you happier, it'll make you have more friends. Well, then the demand for apples goes up. And so you have a new demand curve that looks something like this, D prime. Well, in that situation, what's going to happen? Well, now you have a new equilibrium price. You also have a new equilibrium quantity over here. Let's call that P prime. This is going to define a new marginal revenue curve for the participants in the industry. So M marginal revenue prime. And now all of a sudden, the rational quantity for them to produce would be out here, or at least for this firm to produce. So Q prime for this firm is out here. And you notice at that quantity, it is making economic profit. For every unit it gets that much, it costs that much on average for every unit. So it's making that much per unit. And then you multiply that times the number of units, the quantity. This whole area is going to be the economic profit that this firm is getting. And it's likely that all of the firms, or most of the firms in this perfectly competitive market, are going to be getting it because they all have the same cost structure. But as we've said before, when you have this positive economic profit and there's no barriers to entry, in the long run, more firms will enter because there's economic profit to be had. And in previous videos, we talked about a situation where as firms enter into a market or exit a market, it doesn't change the cost structures of the individual firms. But let's imagine for a second that because of everyone entering into this market that seems to have economic profit for the firms that are participating into it, some of the inputs of, say, growing apples, which is what these firms do, start to go up in cost. So we're not talking about constant cost, perfectly competitive market. Now we're not talking about an increasing cost, perfectly competitive market. Well, then firm A and every firm's cost structure is going to change because as more firms come in, you're going to have to pay more for maybe apple seeds, pay more for maybe pesticides or wax, or maybe pay more for land on which to grow them. And so you would have a different marginal cost curve. Maybe the marginal cost curve now looks like this. So marginal cost curve prime. You would also have a new average total cost curve. Maybe it looks something like this. So average total cost prime. And so you can imagine that firms will jump into the market in order to capture or think that they might be able to get some economic profit, but they will only do so until the economic profit for all the firms goes to zero. So what point will the economic profit go to zero? Well, that's when the marginal revenue for the firms is equal to our marginal cost is equal to our average total cost. So it's that point right over there. So we would get to this point right over here. Let's call that marginal revenue prime. And so more and more firms would enter into the market up until the point that the equilibrium price gets us to P prime. And so the supply would increase. Those folks want to get that economic profit, but it would increase until this point. So it would shift a little bit to the right, and we would get to S prime. As you can see, based on this, we can now start to imagine a long-run supply curve in this increasing cost, perfectly competitive market. We were over here. That was our equilibrium point before. Now we are over here. And so our long-run supply curve in this increasing cost environment, even though it's perfectly competitive, might look something like this. So in a constant cost world, this was a flat line. Now, in an increasing cost world, as more and more people enter the market, the cost structure, the inputs into producing an apple go up. Now, long-run supply is that. Remember, the long run is enough time to go by for people to enter and exit the market, or enough time to go by so fixed costs aren't fixed anymore, that they can be shed or that they could be increased. Now, you could do another thought exercise. Let's say we're dealing with a market where the more people that enter the market, the inputs actually get cheaper. And if that seems hard to believe, you can imagine, well, now people are able to produce seeds or wax at a new scale, so the inputs actually get cheaper. Well, then you would see the opposite thing. Then you would see that as more entrants enter the market, this cost structure goes down, and so the supply can increase more and more and more and more to the point that the equilibrium price is now lower than it was before, and then you would have a downward sloping long-run supply curve.
10 Learn by doing practice question 1. The long-run market equilibrium in a perfectly competitive industry with identical firms results in all firms, A, earning zero economic profit, B, producing the quantity associated with their break-even price, C, producing the profit-maximizing quantity at which M R equals MC, C, producing the profit-maximizing quantity at which M R equals MC. D, all of the above statements are true. Correct answer.